Thank you. Thank you, Dr. E, for having me here today, and to Kathy and Aaron helping me figure all of the logistics of being here. I am really excited to be here today and to get to talk to you. I think it's a huge honor to get to come back and talk to you and share with you my experiences over these past 3 years. You know, it really wasn't that long ago that I was in Dr. E's class. And that I was going through the application process, trying to get into a 4-year university. And then it was just last year that I was trying to get into a graduate program, and I was going through that process as well. And so it's really nice for me to be able to share those experiences with you, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. And I kind of hope to aim for a conversational style talk. You know, I really don't want to talk at you. So if there's something that you want me to elaborate on, feel free to raise your hand and just, you know, ask me to back up or talk a little bit more about that. I'm really happy to do that. And I didn't make plans for afterwards, so if you have questions about my research or projects or some detail I left out, you know, please feel free to bring it up. So the talk today, my adventures in STEM, from bikes to biomechanics, and how being smart isn't enough because the struggle is real and easy is the stuff of fairy tales. Clearly I'm not a journalist. That kind of encapsulates everything that I'm going to talk about today. So let me, sorry. I always have trouble navigating at the beginning of a talk. It's an embarrassing habit. There we go. All right. As I said, the 3 things I'm going to cover today: where I am now, and also part of that story is also how I got here, and it kind of goes between the two of where I am now and also how being smart wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to get me to where I am today. And then finally, what to do when the struggle gets real. Because unfortunately, it will get real. As some of you probably already know, pursuing a STEM degree is a big, big, big challenge. So, where I am today. Me, Franco, I'm kind of a nerd. I ride bicycles. I'm actually a really, really big nerd. And it's kind of appropriate that I go to school now at Nerd Nation, Stanford University. I'm in the mechanical engineering program. This is my first year as a master's student there. My specific degree will be biomechanics, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it's through the mechanical engineering department. And I'm a recent graduate from San Jose State, up in the left-hand corner. You know, go Spartans. I was the president of the Society of Women Engineers. That's us goofing around at conference at UC Santa Cruz. While I was there, I also had the opportunity to be a part of the Salzburg Scholars Program. So I went to Salzburg, Austria, and got to talk about global citizenship and learn about world issues and think out some of those problems with other students. So those are some friends that I made while I was in Austria. I was also a member of the Formula SAE race car team. That's the car that we engineered and raced in Michigan this past year, and those are all of the team members who made the trip out to Michigan. So I'll talk a little bit more about that project later, because I think, just out of curiosity, how many of you will be transferring out of Cañada College in spring of next year? Raise your hands. How many? Fall? I'm sorry, yeah, the application thing. So you'll be entering a 4-year university in the fall of next year, right? Cool. Anybody going to San Jose State? 1, 2, okay. I mean, we're going to say going tentatively, right? Like, you're going to get it. San Francisco State? Any other local? Cool. And anybody going far away? Anybody trying to get out of state?
UMass Lowell.
Okay. Wow. Oh wait, other side. Nice. I guess you'll enjoy the seasons, at least, right? If you do end up at San Jose State, Formula SAE, race car team, great experience. Again, talk more about that later. I work in a research lab. Research is a huge part of my life. Huge part. And I'll talk more about that in a second. And when I'm not in the lab or working on an engineering design project or trying to help light the way for women in engineering, I'm usually riding my bike, racing my bike, hanging out with my nieces, or trying to be a rock climber, which I'm not that great a rock climber, or a cyclist for that matter, but I try to be a good auntie. So what I study, that's kind of the STEM aspect of this talk. Like I said, I'm at Stanford University right now. I'm pursuing my master's. My degree will be in biomechanics. And raise your hand if you've already heard of this term before. Oh man, this is great. Okay, so who wants to give me a definition before I go into mine? Does anyone want to shoot what you've heard of it? No? Really? No one? Okay, all right. So I'll go into the definition I prepared for you today. So to define biomechanics, we start by looking at the word mechanics. And this definition is out of a book that is kind of the basis of biomechanics, but he got this definition from Galileo. And Galileo looked at mechanics as a way of describing forces, motion, strength of materials, right? And so raise your hand, familiar with forces? Everybody, F equals MA? Yeah, we can do that. We've all been in Dr. E's class. So we take the way that we analyze forces, the way that we describe motion, and how we look at the strength of materials, or even better yet, how certain materials respond to forces as inputs, and how some materials respond to motion. We take all of that, and a good example is our airplanes. That's a very straightforward, easy example, right? Because we have something up in the sky that is experiencing multiple forces, right? What's the biggest force that it's going to experience? Gravity. Thank you. Yes. And so we want to overcome this force of gravity, and we'd like to set it into motion. And in order to do some stuff to do that, we do need to take into account what types of materials we're using and how they're going to respond to this whole process. All right, so there is an example of mechanics in play, airplanes. But now we're going to take all of that and we're going to apply it to biology. And who better to describe the application of mechanics to biology than Mr. Tim Howard himself? I'm a fan. So let's just talk about this picture from a biomechanical perspective right now. All right, so first of all, forces. What types of forces is Mr. Howard experiencing at the moment? Gravity. That's the biggest one that's causing him to come down on the ground, right? But the more bio side of things is that there are all of these forces that are acting internally. His muscles are helping keep him upright, correct? Mm-hmm. So these muscles act on his bones, the skeleton, the big structure, and they help keep that structure oriented a certain way. And so he's undergoing this motion, he's experiencing all of these different loads, and now, here's where the materials part gets interesting, because when we talk about materials in statics or in dynamics or in material science, intro to material science, we're mostly looking at fairly straightforward materials like, someone shout one out? Steel, thank you. Steel is a perfect example, right? We can fairly well predict how steel will respond to these inputs. But Mr. Tim Howard, on the other hand, as much as we'd like to say he's a man of steel, he's kind of not. He is made of bone, muscle, blood, right? All of these materials, they do not respond the same way to forces and motion as steel does. And so the area of biomechanics aims to take what we do in traditional mechanical engineering and apply it to situations where the subject will not respond the same way. And it's fairly difficult to predict how that subject will respond. And so the very, very top level of biomechanics would be studying the organism level, right? So Mr. Tim Howard is our organism. And so very, very surface, you could look at him as in terms of applying biomechanics. But if you wanted to go a little bit deeper, you could say, look at one of his muscles. All right, so we could look at one of the muscles in his legs, and now we're looking at a single organ, right? We're no longer looking at the organism, we're looking at the organ. Now, how does that single organ respond to the tensile stress that's being applied, right? Or the compressive stress, right? So when a muscle contracts, is that compressive or tensile? Anybody want to take a guess? So you have a muscle that's that's contracting. Compressed, thank you. It's because it's getting shorter, right? So what does that do to the tissue that makes up that little organ? And what does that do to the cells that make up that little organ? How can we describe those forces? Can we actually come up with equations that describe those forces? And then let's take it one step further. Can this be a useful tool when we try to analyze disease? And so what brought me to Stanford and what brought me into this field is this interest in taking very quantitative methods that we use in mechanical engineering, using them to try to better understand living things that are currently diseased, and then possibly coming up with better ways of characterizing what the disease itself does to the living thing. And it's still kind of a new field. There's definitely a frontier there. So that's what I studied, biomechanics. And a big part of grad school, which I guess now would be a good time. So how many of you think you might be interested in grad school? Okay, and if you were, would you want to do masters? Masters only, raise your hand. PhD, raise your hand. Okay, great. So research is incredibly important if you want to go on to grad school. If you want to get accepted to a graduate program, I would say your most important thing that you can do to help yourself is to, when you get, actually as soon as possible, find a lab to work in and do any type of research project. If you can find one where it's your own project and you're testing your own hypothesis, even if your advisor helps you develop that hypothesis, do it as soon as you can. Don't self-select out of opportunities, even if you think you're too new in your career. You're never too new in your career. Do it as soon as you possibly can, because having research experience as an undergrad will help set you ahead of the pack for when you're applying to graduate school. So I started my research experience at Cañada, actually. My very first research experience was through the COMETS program. Any COMETS program, CPAIR program in here? All right, nice. Yeah, so that was my very first one. I wasn't even at a four-year university yet, and I was doing that. So then when I got to San Jose State, I already had that on my resume, and then when I applied for the NIH-MARC program, they knew that I was serious. They already knew that I was serious about research. 2 years of research at San Jose State, and then when I applied to Stanford, again, they knew that I was serious about research. Because graduate school is all about research and trying to break the frontier. So let me get back to my research. So right now, at Stanford, they hope that you will do about 3 rotations in different research labs to see what your interests are and to experience different things in different fields, things you didn't know about before. So currently, I am a rotating graduate student researcher in the Soft Tissue Biomechanics Lab. So soft, to differentiate from hard, we would be looking at things like musculoskeletal versus bone, right? So your bones are technically a type of tissue. So we don't study bones in our lab, but we do study a lot of cartilage. Does anyone want to take a guess where in your body some cartilage might be found?
Ear,
nose and ears, yes. Where else? Knees. And actually, the knee is the biggest one that our lab looks at. So currently, I'm working on a photochemical bonding project. So a lot of times, you will tear your cartilage, right? It's very common to tear your articular or your fiber cartilage, and when you do so, people need a way of repairing it. It doesn't always self-heal. And so lately, what I've been doing in the lab over the past few months has been taking the meniscus, see how long my leash is. Okay, so this little crescent shape here, that represents the meniscus. And this is actually a figure that I made for an abstract that I submitted to a conference. So I was in the lab for about 2 months I was in the lab for about a month when my research advisor informed me that I was going to be submitting an abstract to conference. And, that I had the opportunity to. He said, well, if you get enough data, you can. And so I ran out and I got some data. I worked like 16-hour days in the lab over and over and over again to get all this data, but it was very worth it, and I was able to submit an abstract within my first 2 months of being at Stanford, which I've been told is kind of crazy. So, but this figure was a part of that abstract. So as a side note, part of doing research sometimes means having skill sets in areas you wouldn't normally think of having. Adobe Illustrator, for instance. So I take this meniscus tissue, I cut it up, I make these different samples, I apply this solution called ALPC, and what it does is when we shine a laser at the fracture site where it's torn, when we shine a laser, it induces cross-linking. And who here can explain cross-linking? You don't have to explain like the very technical way, but does anyone know what cross-linking is? Any chemical engineering people? So polymers, your plastics, they are all they have cross-linking inside of them, right? That's how the molecules are bonded to each other, and that's a terrible explanation. I am obviously not a chemist or a chemical engineer, so I apologize. But what this solution does when you irradiate it is it induces cross-linking between the two surfaces. So this is a photochemical bonding technique, and the lab is doing translational research, so we hope that one day surgeons can use this technique to help repair meniscus tissue. That's the project that I'm currently working on. When I'm finished shining the laser at it, I put it into a testing rig. Now this is to represent something we call an instron, and what the instron does is it pulls the sample apart, right? So you can see here, these are the two parts of the sample originally. I mean, I can pretend that it's still there. The point is, I want to be able to test the mechanical strength of the bond, right? So this cross-linking that happens, you can test both the tensile strength, right? So when you pull it apart, how strong is that bond? And then you can also test the shear strength, which is when the two surfaces are sliding against each other, how strong is that bond? And how much force for a certain area can it withstand before it breaks? And that's a really important number for us to know when we're trying to explain how effective this is as a repair method. That's what I'm doing right now.
Question?
Yes?
Is it the chemical that you put the tissue in actually doing the cross-linking?
Yes, it is. It is a, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the word now. But it is a chemical that when it is hit with light of a certain wavelength, it will only respond to that certain wavelength, and that's what causes the cross-linking.
It's not like a natural tissue cross-linking.
No, exactly, but that's a great question because a key point about this technique as opposed to other things like fibrin glues, which is really, really close to super glue, it's not the exact same, is that this technique does allow for the tissue to grow past that border. So if you tore your meniscus, you would use something like this in addition to sutures, right? So the sutures help create a bigger closure. This would help make sure that there's actually surface contact, and then over time, the goal would be for cells to actually go back in and grow. And that is something that not all bonding agents can do. So a lot of bonding agents will actually prevent that, but this one does not, which is really cool. All right, so that's what I'm doing right now. there were two projects that I wanted to talk to you about really shortly that sort of helped me get to where I am right now. The first one was race car. This was at San Jose State, so Formula SAE. Anybody heard of Formula SAE before? Yes. All right, so Formula SAE is a student engineering competition where you are to, as a team, engineer and then race a vehicle that is very, very similar to a Formula One vehicle. It's an open wheel design. We have full aero package. And so as my senior project, which many of you, if you do go into a four-year university for an engineering degree, many schools do require you to do a senior capstone project. It's a year-long project, for San Jose State at least. And so I wanted to do race car because I had been doing all of this biomechanics research, and race cars are cool. That really is about it. And so I like to try to break up talks with YouTube videos sometimes. So I'm going to show you a video that I made for that project. And if it gets too long, we can stop it. So I was on this sub-team within the bigger team of myself, two other people. We were responsible for the drivetrain components. So what you see in the lower corner here is the electropneumatic shifting system. And then we also had a custom sprocket carrier and custom sprockets, both front and rear. So this uses a motorcycle engine, 600cc motorcycle engine from a Honda F4i. A little spec about how fast the car is. The car only weighs about 420 pounds without the driver. So 0 to 60, 2.85, give you some. This is really cool. So you can see the step shafts. Well, you can't see the step shafts, but you can see the tripod housings that go into the differential. This was all part of the project that we did. It took us about a year to complete. And then we went with the car to Michigan. I only went to Michigan. They also went to Canada and to Lincoln, Nebraska. So 3 competitions in 1 year. It's something to think about when you go to a 4-year university, if they have a formula team. A lot of the people on this team ended up going to work at SpaceX, at Tesla. So having a project like that on the side is a great way really great way to build your resume if you're not interested in research. And it seems like a tangent, but it was an important experience for me because it kind of gave me an idea of what I liked doing for fun, but maybe not so much for research. And I think that that's an important point. Exploring your options, seeing what's out there, seeing what all constitutes mechanical engineering, from bikes to race cars to biomechanics. And going through that world, and not just mechanical engineering, you can say there's similar ranges for all other types of engineering, for science. Seeing what you're interested in, that exploration process is really important because even if you decide that you don't like doing something, that's one thing you can eliminate off your list and go find something else that you like. So while I was doing race car, I was also working in the Wilkinson Neurophysiology Lab, where I won't go too far into detail with this, but let me see where the best place to go is. So what we did in this lab was we tried to understand how the system responds to chronic inflammation. So when you have the flu, you feel kind of achy, right? You're kind of sore, you have a hard time moving, and exactly why that happens isn't really understood yet. And so in our lab, we looked at, all right, when the system is inflamed, what's actually happening in the muscles? And so I would look at these muscles, and we would stretch them, right? So I'm putting these muscles in tension, and I'm measuring the responding force, right? So how much tension is in the muscle as I'm stretching it, for how big the muscle is, and then also how much of a displacement I'm causing. And I would do this for both the inflamed and the non-inflamed muscles and try to understand whether or not the inflammation was changing something about the mechanical properties of the muscle. Can anybody name a mechanical property? If, let's say, steel. Let's say I ask you, what's the mechanical property of steel? It's kind of it can be a tricky question, so don't. Tensile strength, beautiful. Who's that? Is that you? Nice, thank you. That's a perfect example. A tensile strength is a mechanical property. One of the ones I was trying to look at was stiffness, right? And usually when we look at stiffness in certain materials, is Young's modulus familiar to anybody? Okay, yeah, so Young's modulus. Can we come up with an effective Young's modulus for a skeletal muscle? And then can we see, is that Young's modulus changing depending on inflammation state? And obviously this was pretty ambitious for an undergraduate program, as I'm finding now that I'm at Stanford and realizing that even at Stanford it's still kind of a challenging project. But I did that for 2 years, and I found that, yeah, this is really what I want to do. This is what I'm interested in. So finally, along the lines of who I am and what I do, my future interests, as I said, I'm a brand new graduate student. I'm bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I haven't been beaten down yet. And I still kind of walk around campus and talk to different students and meet different professors and have a squirrel moment. You know, it's still a really exciting time, and there are a lot of different areas of research that interest me in biomechanics. So I've told you about 2 of them now, right? About the photochemical bonding, and then also looking at the muscle. But there are a couple of more. In case you're interested in these things and you want to go out and look at more opportunities along those lines. The picture on the top, this is studying fracture mechanics in bones. This is still a very interesting area of research because it's something we still don't quite understand yet. And there are a lot of diseases where the bone degrades, and then we'd like to be able to better understand what that's doing in terms of fracture mechanics of bone. Another area of interest is in hearing. So this is along the lines of mechanotransduction. That's a buzzword. If you go Google mechanotransduction, you may be really excited about that field. So looking at how sound is transmitted through the ear, but then better yet, again, let's say someone is experiencing some type of hearing loss. You know, what can we do with our mechanical engineering tools to help them overcome that hearing loss? And then finally, another interesting area is in touch and how we perceive touch and being able to characterize touch. And this is especially interesting to robotics. Anybody interested in robotics out there? Have you guys been following the research in terms of sensory feedback? Yeah, so haptics is a huge area in that. Who said haptics? Okay, sorry. So you might want to look up Allison Okamura. She's at Stanford. She's a professor there, and she does a ton of great work in haptics. And I'm sure you probably already know of Intuitive Surgical. Yeah, that's a local company you should know about. All right, so that's research. That's projects. Man, that's a lot of stuff. So I'll try to speed things along here because let's see, we have about 13 minutes. So my background, I wanted to first let you know who I am today because I think it gives a little bit more. It's a little bit interesting where I came from. So this is me, a really embarrassing little kid picture with my older sister, one of them, and my little brother. And this was actually taken at a homeless shelter. So for a certain part of my life, I only lived with my mom, so I didn't know my dad until I was 9 or 10 years old. And my mom was often a single mother trying to raise 3 kids. And there were times where we would live in a homeless shelter, or we would, have to stay in our car and whatnot. And so I chose this picture because this is where I started out. And not like, you should have this, oh wow, going so far moment, but just, it's still a big part of who I am, right? And so I finally met my dad when I was 9 or 10 years old, went to live with him, went to high school in Gilroy, and as you can imagine, there was a lot of turmoil. It doesn't, those types of things don't just go away overnight. And all through high school, all I wanted to do was art. I love art, I love poetry still, and so I thought I wanted to run off to Paris and be a bohemian and write poetry and paint. And a part of me still definitely does want to do that one day. But, I didn't know anything about engineering. I had no clue what engineering was. And I didn't have any college options. So I moved out of my dad's house when I was 18 as soon as I graduated from high school. And I went and worked full-time. And I tried to take classes here or there. As Dr. E reminded me, I also worked for a company called Magic Princess, where I went to birthday parties dressed like Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella, and did magic shows. That was the low point of my career. And eventually, trying to do community college classes, it was really hard. I mean, how many of you have jobs outside of school? I figured a lot of you would. It's and it is. I can really empathize with that. I know how difficult it is, and it got to the point where I couldn't do it anymore. I was, it was just too hard to try to work 80-hour weeks to make enough money while taking classes. And so I kind of resigned myself to this life of, I love bikes. I'm going to race bikes. I'm going to work in a bike shop. I'm really happy with that life. And I was. And it wasn't until a friend was like, Joy, you really need to go back to school. You need to go back to school. You need to finish your degree. And for some reason, it just kind of clicked. I was like, okay, sure, I'll do that. And luckily, I landed here at Cañada College. And I landed in Dr. E's class. And I knew that I wanted to do mechanical engineering because of bicycles. So I was racing my bike one day. It was a terrible race. It was pouring down rain. It was so cold. I was about 2.5 hours into the race when I got to this point on the course. It was a mountain bike race called what we like to call the death march, where you really do have to get off your bike and push it up this hill because it's about a 20% grade. And I'm really not enjoying life at that moment when I look ahead and I see this racer who has a prosthetic lower leg. And that was kind of a humbling moment, right? Because I'm like, well, he's doing it, and I'm complaining about doing it. So that race inspired me to look into the area of robotics and into prosthetics and biomedical devices and things like that. And mechanical engineering for me was it was an easy decision. It was like, yes, I'm going to do that. And I knew that if I wanted to go into some of those areas where research are big hot topics and there's a big frontier, having a PhD seemed like the right thing to do. And so it was about 2010 that I said, all right, not only am I going to go get my bachelor's in mechanical engineering, I'm going to go straight into getting a PhD afterwards as well. And so that's about the time I landed at Cañada and when I started out on this path. And now I'm at Stanford. So because I'm running out of time here, because I talk too much, I wanted to get to the main point, which I didn't leave a lot of time for the really, really big idea, because this is a big idea. This is a huge idea. I'm going to do my best to try to explain it. Smart is not enough because the struggle is real and easy is the stuff of fairy tales. Does that resonate with anybody? Yeah, the struggle is real. Thank you. So it was almost kind of a joke that I came up with this idea as being a main point for the topic, but then I realized it absolutely is true. It's an important thing to talk about because I can tell you, being a student at Stanford, the hardest thing for me is having imposter syndrome, where I wake up every day and I look around and say, these people are so smart. I don't belong here. Do they know who I am? Was it a mistake? You know, kind of pinch me. And so in my own journey, I have struggled with this issue a lot. And so it was really nice to put together this presentation and to formalize these ideas on why it's not about being smart. And being smart is not enough. And here's my word tree proof. I started by looking up the word smart, looking up the definition: intelligent, bright, amusingly clever, quick and energetic, candid, sharp in dealings. None of which means very much. It doesn't describe anything to me, at least. It's just a bunch of extra words. And nothing really says, what does it mean to be smart, and how can you apply being smart to being successful? But I did see this word sharp, and I thought, okay, you know what, actually, I do kind of like that word sharp. If I had to refer to someone that I see as successful, sharp would probably come to mind. So I look up that word, and this is a game that I like to play. I love words, love etymology. Words can be really fun to me. And it's kind of a geometric description, right? Like, it's not really describing a person at first, it's describing a thing. Except when we get down to this part, shrewd and astute. I thought, okay, that's a funny word, astute. I love that word, but let me look that up. And finally, I get to some Latin roots. I know, we're going deep, deep, deep here, way back in time. And I had never seen this word before. And I'm pretty sure I still can't pronounce it, so I'm not going to try. But I know that it comes from French, because droit in French means right. And I'm like, that's so weird. How did we get from smart to a Latin root that refers to a French word? And again, the final step, I looked that up, and finally, I came to something worthwhile. Proficient under pressing conditions. I kid you not, this was the journey I went through while preparing for this presentation. That it took me all of those words to finally get to a point that accurately describes what you do need in order to be successful along your path. And smart was definitely not enough for it. And so, what you do need, where the application is, how can you be successful, and how can you apply this idea of being proficient? This is just one idea of how you can do it, by the way. There are many, many, many ways to achieve success. But this is my own personal little algorithm. 3 steps. In 3 steps, you can achieve success. So the first one is setting a goal. I personally, I like goals. I like to set goals. And in setting a goal, I found that I have to have an open mind. I have to have a willingness to explore. Like I was talking about with race car and with the neurophysiology lab, I have to have an open mind when I'm exploring the realm of possibilities, because there are so many different goals that I could set, but which one do I really want to set? I also have to be very honest with myself, because by definition, setting a goal means placing something you can't attain at that moment, right? So I'm saying to myself, I want to do something that I'm not capable of doing right now, whether it's because I don't have the time or the knowledge or whatever. It means being honest with myself and honestly saying, I'm not where I want to be in life. And that's not an easy thing to do. That's actually kind of challenging. And finally, it takes bravery, because you're going to face skeptics. There are so many people who will look at you when you set that goal and say, no way can you do that. No way, that is impossible. And being able to set that goal, despite what those skeptics say, it takes bravery. And nowhere in there do you see the word smart or anything remotely close to the definitions that I just showed you. The next step, choosing a path. You have this goal, but now how do you get there? And actually, this is my visual aid for how do you get there. Because there's not just one path between where you start and your goal. You could take a really long, twisty, windy way. You could take the shortest path, or you could take some combination of those two. So being able to plan a path to your goal is one of the most important skills I think that you can really develop in your time through academia. And doing so, it takes foresight, right? You have to be able to say, all right, if I make this decision, what are the consequences of this decision? What are the possible outcomes? On top of that, again, you have to be willing to take a chance because you could fail. Unfortunately, a lot of us do fail. You will fail again and again and again and again. And so being willing to risk, to take risks in the chance of a reward, sometimes there's not a reward. It takes bravery. Again, nowhere in there does it say smart. And then finally, in order to actually get to your goal, you have to stay on track. And staying on track, obviously, commitment, because you've committed to this goal. And sure, sometimes that goal may change. It absolutely will. My goals have changed over the years. But once I make that goal, I stay committed until I decide that there is a better goal for me. Passion. You know, I can't speak to that point enough. If you're not passionate about what you do, I really think you should find something else. Because there are times when it's difficult and your passion is what keeps you on that path. And finally, there's a touch of foolishness. You know, when you're sleep deprived and you're getting sick because you're going through finals and you have these projects looming and these deadlines that are pressing at you, the smart thing to do would probably be to get some rest. But I'm not going to sugarcoat things. You really can't do that sometimes. And many of you know that. How many of you know that? Yeah, exactly. You really can't afford to take that rest. And so you do need to be a little bit foolish and say, yeah, this hurts, but you know what? I'm going to keep doing it because I know that I need to in order to stay on my path. And so when I was putting together this presentation, I ran this huge, lofty idea of being smart not enough to a friend, and he's much smarter than I. And he put it this way. I loved the way that he put it so much that I decided to put it in a quote for you. Because the smart guy walks into the room, looks at his opponent, realizes it's a fight he can't win, and walks away. There's nothing to gain by being beat. He lives to fight another day and maybe pick an opponent he knows he can beat. The fool walks into the room, he knows he's outmatched. He knows he may get hurt, but he takes a swing anyway because he has a lot to gain. And so if being smart is not enough, then what? Like I mentioned, passion. When I was on the race car team, part of what drove me to be on that team was that I could smell the passion a mile away, and it wasn't just the lack of deodorant from people not showering because they were working. I saw that people were really passionate about what they were doing, and I wanted to be a part of that. It takes will. This is me after probably not sleeping for 2 days, because you have to have the will to keep going, as many of you know. It takes being flexible, like if you're riding your bike, mountain biking, or through the city streets. Sometimes the path that you're on ends up being the wrong one, and you have to be flexible and switch over to another. And you really do have to have a good sense of humor, because you have to be able to laugh at yourself. This is me in my new lab. Warning, these people are inside. And finally, the word that I've thrown around a lot today is bravery. This is one of my favorite quotes. Impossible is just a big word thrown around by small men who find it easier to live in the world they've been given than to explore the power they have to change it. Impossible is not a fact, it's an opinion. Impossible is not a declaration, it's a dare. Impossible is potential. Impossible is temporary. Impossible is nothing. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and putting up with my ramblings. And if you would like, you can find me at engineeringjoy.com.